Do you ever find yourself in a state of hypervigilance? Do you find yourself walking down the street, always looking at your surroundings in anticipation for whatever might happen? That hypervigilance oftentimes can be a sign of trauma. If you said yes to that, know that you are not alone. I know that when we talk about trauma, there can be a lot of triggers and judgment and stigma around it. But the truth is, so many of us experience trauma. I wish that wasn't the truth. But a recent study came out, and 70% of adults in the US reported experiencing a traumatic experience, at least one. Many of those in that survey reported multiple traumatic experiences. I'm Des Caminos, and welcome to my day 4 of my 7-day live series to raise BPD awareness while sharing some empowering tools. The thing is, like I said, so many of us experience trauma. But for many people with BPD, a significant number of those who have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder have experienced some trauma in their lives. Oftentimes, that experience of trauma is a big contributing factor into the development of BPD. But today, what I'm going to be doing for the Day 4 series is I'm going to be talking about how to overcome trauma. How can we really overcome trauma and move forward with life, whether you are living a life beyond the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder or trying to move forward with the general life that you deserve, a life that you love, where you can process that painful past experience and still find a way to be resilient from a place of choice, not out of obligation. So like I said, hi, I'm Des Caminos. I'm an embodiment coach and somatic practitioner. And in 2014, I was diagnosed with BPD. And to say that I had had trauma feels like the understatement of the year. I had so many different levels of trauma, from acute trauma to chronic to complex. And I'll be diving a lot more into that during this video. So just to give you a little overview of what we're going to be covering, we're going to be talking about 3 different types of traumas, as well as how trauma can show up not just in the body, but as well in life, maybe some behavioral patterns that you might be experiencing. And of course, I'm going to share with you 3 different ways to overcome trauma so you can really start to take action. Because I love giving these videos to raise awareness, but the truth is, awareness without action can feel extremely limiting. Have you ever had that experience where you become aware of something, but then there's no action around it? How do you feel? Oftentimes, many of us feel stuck or trapped or resentful. And so just remember that nothing cuts faster through fear or resistance than taking action. And awareness without action can be extremely limiting. So that being said, if you are ready, go ahead and give me a woohoo in the comments. Even if you're watching this in the replay, trust me, I can always feel the energy of people who are watching the replay and the comments that they share. So please be sure to engage with me and let me know what are some big takeaways for you, so I can always make sure that this is in alignment for the community. Because I'm here to be a resource for others, the resource I wish I had had in my journey of healing. So coming back to trauma, when we talk about trauma, like I said, I know it can be triggering despite that, and probably because so many of us have experienced it. When I'm talking about trauma for the purpose of this video, I send everybody magical glasses. They're right in front of you. When we're talking about trauma, I'm going to invite you to put on the glasses that I just sent you. And we're going to be looking at trauma through this lens, through the lens of not having our needs met. So we're going to be talking about trauma in any way, shape, or form where we didn't have our needs met. Now, the thing is, when we are younger going through trauma, when our needs aren't being met, they're going to come with a multitude of emotions and thoughts. And we don't always know how to process those emotions when we're younger. The truth is, we don't really know how to process those emotions as adults either. We don't really live in a world or a culture where we are giving children, teens, young adults, even adults, the tools and templates to really process difficult emotions like shame, guilt, resentment, sadness, anger, which is why it can be really difficult to go through these traumatic experiences where our needs weren't being met and not know how to process them. They're going to come out in our adult life in a myriad of different ways. But for the point of this video, again, trauma is not having our needs met. And in that place of trauma, it can be really difficult to cope with those processes. Some ways that trauma might show up in our thought patterns is through fear, hopelessness, what's the point? It can be a lot of intrusive thoughts. Sometimes trauma, when left unresolved, can also lead to bigger emotions and mental states like anxiety, depression, insomnia. Those are just a couple of examples, and some behavioral ways that it can show up is, like I said in the beginning of this video, through hypervigilance. We might be experiencing this hypervigilance of always having to be on, always in anticipation for the worst case scenario, because that's a way that our nervous system is going to try and regulate and find safety. So those are just some ways that trauma shows up. And a great kind of metaphor to really be looking at this is, imagine that you are a tree, or that we see a tree in the wild in beautiful nature, and it gets struck by lightning. That lightning is going to be like the trauma, and the tree is going to be like the individual who's experiencing it. That lightning bolt that hit that tree might leave it with a lot of external scars. Maybe you might notice that the tree is red or black or discolored in that space. Hey, Alex. And so being able to look at trauma through this example of just a tree being hit in the wild, it's going to have those external scars, but we're not going to always know what internal damage was done. A lot of times when trees get hit with lightning, it can take a really difficult time for it to recover. It might begin to decay or rot on the inside, depending on the level of trauma or on how strong that lightning bolt was that hit it. Now, just like a tree, people are going to be able to have that experience as well, going through a traumatic experience, and you might be able to see some visible external scars, like maybe some behavioral patterns that are changing. Maybe someone's more reactive or in that place of hypervigilance, always looking for the worst case scenario. But there might be a lot of internal wounds as well that can happen. The way in which the brain might shift in terms of safety and be a lot more responsive to giving off some of those stress hormones like cortisol and all of those other things. We don't always know what level of impact these traumatic experiences can have. But just like a tree, I promise that it is possible to learn how to navigate and process the trauma in a way that's healthy for you, in a way that's healthy for the people around you. And being able to process that trauma can be so beautiful, because just like that tree, you might see the scar, but the trunk might eventually grow over it. Your branches will begin to grow, leaves will begin to flourish. It is possible to overcome trauma. I promise. Again, I'm a woman who's experienced a lot of it. And so what I want to dive into now are the 3 different types of trauma. So there are 3 different types of trauma that I'd really like to cover today. And the first one is acute trauma. Now, acute trauma is going to be an isolated experience, an isolated traumatic experience. For example, a natural disaster. If you've gone through a natural disaster like a hurricane or a tornado, that would be an example of an isolated traumatic experience, or an acute one. And I'm not talking about triangles, but traumas. And so we've got acute one, which is an isolated experience. The second trauma that we're going to be talking about is chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is going to be prolonged trauma. So what I mean by that, it's going to be some experience that was, again, with all of your trauma glasses on, where your needs weren't met, that went over a duration of time. It was difficult to process. Examples could be childhood abuse or neglect, combat experience, if you have ever served in combat. Those are going to be examples of prolonged trauma. So again, we've got acute trauma, which is an isolated instance. We've got chronic trauma, which is going to be a prolonged over a set of time. And then we've got complex trauma. And complex trauma is really an exposure to multiple different traumatic experiences. Oftentimes, complex traumas tend to show up in childhood. So it's a combination of possibly abuse or neglect, or again, just not having our needs met. A lot of people who have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, like I said, have had a traumatic experience in their life. More often than not, complex, because it's in that stages of our life where our brain is developing, where trauma is going to impact it. Write in the comments, yes or no, if you think that trauma can play an impact on the development of the brain. So the answer is yes. Yes, trauma can play a really big impact on the brain, because in that space of trauma, our body and brain, our nervous system is going to go into a state of survival. Different parts of our brain are going to be activated, and because our brain is meant to keep us safe, it's going to hold on to that traumatic experience to really be able to process it. We want to make sure that we're going to be safe and that this traumatic thing doesn't happen, that we don't feel these intense emotions. And in that place, really being able to rewire the brain. But even though the brain might rewire itself in that place of trauma, it's just as possible to rewire itself in the place of processing and coping with traumatic experiences. So, those are the three types of trauma. And I invite you just to think about, if you've experienced trauma, which ones have you experienced? Is it acute, an isolated experience? Is it chronic, something that was maybe prolonged? Or is it complex, where you experienced a multiple traumatic events? Again, there's no judgment. Being able to acknowledge and look at our traumas from that place of discovery and compassion is going to offer a different way that our brain processes it. So just take a big breath. I know that trauma can be heavy and overwhelming, but it doesn't always have to be. I hope that these little metaphors like the tree and the lightning are safe ways for you to start looking at your trauma through a different lens. So those are the three types of trauma. And now I want to talk to you about how it might show up in your life. If you've gone through a traumatic experience, I invite you to think about, how do you think trauma shows up for you? Maybe it shows up in behavioral patterns like disassociation or drinking when you get triggered, kind of that escaping, that avoidance. Maybe your trauma shows up in other areas as well, such as limiting beliefs. So maybe you've got a set of rules that you start to follow because, hey, I don't want that traumatic thing to happen again. Maybe you were in a big party with a big group of friends and you felt judged or dismissed or ridiculed. Maybe a rule that you have around that acute, that isolated traumatic experience is you don't go out to parties anymore. Being able to see what rules we have in our life around traumas can really help us to figure out where they're starting to impact our life. Where are the traumas starting to impact our life? And how can we start to create new responses to those old rules? Now, a big thing of finding new responses to old rules is finding gentle ways to safely start challenging these thoughts. But before I go into how to really start overcoming your trauma, I want to talk to you about how trauma might show up in your life. Because if we don't know how trauma is showing up, it's going to be a little bit harder for us to process and to really get to that core issue of how to start creating new responses to live a life of freedom, safety, and stability. So, how does trauma show up for you? For a couple of my clients, it shows up in a myriad of different ways, and I want to share with you a couple of them. So, a lot of my clients experience re-experiencing. So, re-experiencing that trauma. So, again, these might be triggers that come into their life, whether it's a smell, a sound, or a person, or even the idea, the conceptual idea of something that can give them this re-experiencing. How that's going to show up is going to be intrusive thoughts. So, that inner critic might be extremely loud with things of what if, you should have, giving you lots of judgment. It might also show up as nightmares. If you are re-experiencing that trauma at night when your subconscious is starting to process, that could be a way that your trauma is starting to show up in your life. Some other ways that can show up on how to kind of process trauma is avoidance. So are you avoiding situations, experiences? Are you, another great thing about avoidance, maybe not great, but another part of avoidance that I think a lot of people don't talk about or avoid is going to be escaping. Are you escaping the reality that you're in because you're trying to avoid some thought or some experience? Ways that people tend to escape or hide is alcohol, work, relationships, or other self-destructive behaviors. Some other quick things that I want to share, like I said, hypervigilance is a really big one that tends to show up in people as well, and kind of how they process that trauma. So being in that state of always aware, what's going on, what surroundings, if this were to happen right now, what would I do? Kind of following off that, some other things are negative moods or negative kind of cognitive states, such as unstable sense of self, negative beliefs about you or the people around you, negative beliefs about your environment, about your capacity to thrive or capacity to be. And the last thing that I want to share is just kind of reactive. So being reactive with maybe angry outbursts or reckless behaviors, or maybe even difficulty sleeping. And those are some different ways that trauma can show up in your life. And again, I want to really make sure that everybody's aware of the different types of trauma, because I know there's so much judgment and stigma around it. There's so much judgment and stigma around trauma that sometimes it can make everybody kind of shut down. Like, I don't want to say the T word. I don't want to talk about this experience that I had. So really being able to just be aware of how it might be showing up in your life, so that way you can really start to take inventory, take stock without judgment, as if you were a grocery store clerk, and your body and experiences and behaviors were the things that you were taking inventory in. Where is trauma showing up? Where are maybe some coping strategies missing? And how can I restock myself in a way that I can really move past this trauma? I can move forward with my life, whether it's with BPD or just with other experiences. So, okay, Des, I've learned enough about trauma. Give me the good stuff. Okay, stop, you guys. Hey, Jeffrey. What I want to share with you now are a couple of different ways to overcome trauma and really some different things that really helped me as well in my processing of my complex trauma. And again, I was diagnosed in 2014 with borderline personality disorder. BPD is really fueled oftentimes by these traumatic experiences, like I said, and it shows up for people with BPD in a lot of different ways, such as distorted sense of self, self-destructive behaviors, intense fears of abandonment, mood swings, self-destructive behaviors, self-harm, and a lot of other. If you've got any questions about that, just let me know. I'm here for it all. So, some ways to kind of process your trauma, and again, how I did it as well as a person who's living with borderline personality disorder, was one, I had to make a decision to really be resilient and not resilient out of obligation. Not resilient out of obligation, but resilient out of choice. Let that sink in for a moment. So often than not, when I was trying to overcome my trauma, it was because I was trying to cope with the behaviors that were coming as a result of my trauma, such as explosive anger or avoidance by escaping in alcohol or self-destructive behaviors. I really found that in my place of being resilient, of showing up for myself and trying to overcome trauma, I was being resilient out of place of obligation. I had to do it. It was something that I felt I needed to get done on my to-do list to be a complete person. When I'm in that place of being resilient out of obligation, when you are as well, your mindset is in that state of surviving. I have to survive, so I've got to be resilient out of obligation. When you can shift in that internal narrative around being present and mindful and resilient out of choice, I'm choosing to be resilient. Now you get to kind of shift that mindset pattern from one of surviving into thriving, one out of obligation and into choice. So when it comes to overcoming trauma, making sure that you are aligned with your intention of why you're doing it is going to be so powerful. Why do you want to overcome your trauma? Is it because you're trying to get a better understanding of your behavioral patterns and sense of self to live a life of safety, stability, and fulfillment? Or are you doing it because a partner says that you've got to figure it out, that you need to seek help because you're doing it for your family, you're doing it for your job? No judgment. No judgment for whatever reason you're doing it. I did it for everybody else except me for decades. But just take a moment and just check in with yourself as to where your resilience and where your choice is coming from. Once you kind of have really connected to where you're moving into this place of direction, the other three things that I want to share with you are one, finding support. Finding support. Oftentimes when we are experiencing trauma, it ends up putting us into this space of isolation. I've gone through this traumatic experience. No one else can understand. Also, maybe I don't want it can isolate us because we have this idea, this notion that no one else can understand, that we are the only person who's experienced this who will understand it. And although that is at some level true, you are the only person who experienced that trauma. You don't have to be alone in processing it. There can be other people who can be empathetic and hold that space of safety for you. But because we go into the state of isolation, we push others away. And also, oftentimes than not, we don't want to talk about our traumas because the world that we live in, like I said, tends to have a lot of judgment and stigma. We aren't taught how to ask for help. We aren't taught how to ask for support. I mean, think about it. Let me know in the comments. Were you taught how to ask for help? And let me know in the comments too. When it comes to asking for help, what are some kind of ideas that we have around it as a society? For me, I grew up with the idea of asking for help was a sign of weakness. It made you look vulnerable, that people would take advantage of you because they would know that you're weak or that you need help. Because we don't live in a culture where we're taught how to ask for support or help, and we go through traumatic experiences which make us feel isolated and put us in our head, it can be really difficult to ask and seek support. But when it comes to overcoming trauma, support is so important. Having that support is going to allow you to be witnessed in your sense of safety, in your space of resilience and growth. It's also going to be able to give you some powerful tools and resources. So please seek support if you've gone through a traumatic experience. Don't go through the journey alone. Oftentimes than not, we went through a traumatic experience being witnessed in relation to someone, something saw our traumatic experience, kind of put us in that space. So being able to be witnessed in our place of overcoming trauma can be really powerful as well, because it's going to mirror that part of the nervous system that was in relation to others when the wound originally occurred. So find support. You are not alone. There's so much power that can come in your expression as well of processing your trauma. When you can say it out loud, when you can feel the vibration of the words coming off of your lips as you share it with other people, it's going to give it a very different feeling and integration than going through the ruminating thought patterns in your head. So, first way to overcome trauma is one, find support. The second way that I'd like to share with you is check in with your reality. Check the reality. This is a tool that's used in dialectical behavioral therapy, also known as DBT, which is really powerful again for people who've experienced borderline personality disorder or have been diagnosed or might be experiencing BPD symptoms. Checking reality is so powerful because when we are in a space of trauma, when our brain goes into that space of survival, it's really easy for our mind to start coming up with narratives, stories. Oh, I'm thinking that this person doesn't want to talk to me right now, or maybe this person's mad at me because they haven't responded to my text in the last 5 minutes. And then the brain starts to come up with evidence as to why that person might be mad at you. Well, did I do this? Well, maybe this happened. Or maybe a worst case scenario, again, that hypervigilance coming back out. Have you ever done that? Have you ever maybe lost your wallet and just come up with a story as to what happened? Have you ever had someone not respond and you come up with a story about what's going on? It's so easy for us to step into alternative realities in our mind because we're trying to find some reason to understand what we're experiencing. Think about how that might affect someone who's gone through trauma. If someone who's gone through trauma is looking to find that sense of coping, that sense of grounding, and wants to be in it, it can be difficult because the mind is going to pull them out of that experience, and it's going to come to a multiple different ways. This is happening, maybe that. So, really being able to check the facts and come back to the reality is so powerful when it comes to experiencing trauma, because trauma is going to want to pull us out of the experience, out of the present, out of the facts, out of the current reality, and into a distorted reality that's going to kind of integrate the experiences that we've had in our past, because our brain is trying to prepare us for the future. Some great ways to kind of check the facts are just ask yourself, okay, well, maybe they're mad at me because I've done this. Do I know they're mad at me? Have they said that they're mad? No. Okay, so that's not a part of the facts that I have right now for the reality that I'm in. So that's a great way, is really just checking the facts that simply. And another great way is just to really be mindful. Be mindful of what you're experiencing, of what's being said, and just trying to take things as cut and dry as you're reading them. It can be a really great way to regulate the nervous system and again, bring you in the present moment as opposed to taking you into a past experience of trauma. The third thing that I want to share with you is have coping strategies. There is nothing wrong with having coping strategies or self care soothing techniques that can be really powerful for you. Because when we are getting triggered, when we're experiencing or reliving that trauma, our nervous system is still processing. It doesn't feel safe. Our mind is still sending off those stress chemicals. Our prefrontal cortex is still inhibited. So that rational thought, that focus, that memory might not be as on as normal because we've had some experience that's really shaken up our sense of safety. Being able to have coping strategies is going to be a great way to soothe the nervous system and really find that place of internal groundedness. Because when our brain starts to go into that state of survival, our body is going to go into that state of survival as well. So let me know in the comments, what are some coping strategies that you have? For myself, a couple coping strategies that I have is I love engaging in mindfulness, whether it's finding 10 orange things in the room around me. I love engaging my senses, specifically my sense of touch. So sometimes when you're experiencing maybe that hypervigilance or that feeling of intrusive thought, engage in a mindfulness practice, whether you're looking for orange things or rubbing the fingers so gently that you can feel each ridge on the thumbs, each ridge on your hands. What does that feel like? That can be a great coping strategy. There are so many coping strategies in distress tolerance, which is a form of dialectical behavioral therapy. But a couple of things that I want to share with you is when you're going through trauma, engaging in mindfulness can be really powerful. Having something ice cold, putting an ice cube on your arm, on your forehead, on a part of your body is going to be a great way to regulate the nervous system because, again, when we're in that space of survival, the blood's going to be rushing to that part of our brain that's putting us in that state of fight, flight, or freeze. So by putting something cold on the body, we are calming the nervous system down and having it reallocate blood. So those are just a couple of coping strategies. If you want more support on any of this, drop a purple little heart in the comments and I'll reach out to you privately and we can see if we can find some coping strategies that are unique to you. Because the truth is, it's not always a one size fits all. So just to recap, the 3 ways that I wanted to share with you on how to overcome trauma. The bonus first one, which isn't a part of it, is just to connect to your why. Why are you in the space of wanting to overcome your trauma? Why are you bringing in your resilience? Is it from a place of obligation or are you doing it for yourself? Really being able to connect to that why is going to be so powerful. No judgment either way. And then the 3 things that you can really do are 1, find support. Reach out to other people. Don't stay in a space of isolation because that's going to ground your nervous system into that state of survival even more. Number 2, check the facts. So really be mindful and try as much as you can to stay present in the reality that you're in without allowing your brain to come up with lots of different stories and excuses as to why whatever it is that you're experiencing might be happening. Stay in the reality. And the third thing is really have coping strategies ready. When you are in that space of going into hypervigilance, avoidance, or a state of survival, what is it that you need to feel safe, to feel regulated? Whether it's engaging in mindfulness practices, putting an ice cube on your arm, or anything in between, like writing, taking a hot shower, going for a nice walk, calling a friend, whatever it is, just know that it's going to be unique to you. I'm Des Caminos. I'm an embodiment coach. Thank you so much for being here. For anybody who's looking for more support, I invite you to join me May 1st for my most raw and vulnerable event yet. It is open to everyone, man, woman. It is going to be catered to individuals with borderline personality disorder because May 1st is BPD Awareness Day. I'm going to be sharing 3 keys to find safety, stability, and fulfillment so you can really live a life beyond a diagnosis. If you are interested in that, I'll be dropping a link in the comments, and there's also a link in my bio. If you need any help or support, just know I've got your back. If you know of anyone who can benefit from this series, please share it with them. The truth is, we are all in this together. Thank you so much for being a part of this community. And just remember that together we radiate, together we rise.